I want to talk about something important. It is this meme that is actually starting to go viral that I'm seeing by the fascist LARPers, people trying to rehabilitate historical fascism. And it's a myth that I first encountered when the liar Keith Woods and his debate partner, when I first debated them with Logo, they brought this up, and it was the first time I heard this lie. But it's gaining a lot of traction. So one of the reasons these people say that China is fascist and that, oh, it's just Italy's also fascist, I've seen this on X so many times, and I want you guys to make memes to counteract it. I want you guys to be prepared with sources to respond to this because it's a lie. They claim that in the mid-1930s, the fascist state in Italy took over 80% of the economy and nationalized 80% of the economy and controlled 80%. They said, it's the same thing as China! The IRI, which is what it was called. They created something called the IRI. This institute, it basically, it had controlling shares in a bunch of different firms. So it's the same thing in China! How the state has controlling firms everywhere and they control the economy. It's about the control. It's about the iron fist of the fascist authority. They're controlling the capitalists, and the capitalists in Italy are under control by the state. Okay, so this is the lie that they say, that 80% of the economy was owned by the state in Italy, that the IRI was an instrument of genuine nationalization. And I'm here to debunk that myth so you can respond to this lie properly and know what you're talking about. So let's talk about Italy. So first of all, by the early 30s, the whole world was witnessing a banking crisis and a general crisis of capitalism. So across the world, companies were underperforming. There was a crisis in the rate of profit. I don't have to get into it. Yada, yada, yada. There was a banking crisis, all sorts of problems going on in the world, right? And this hit Italy very hard. Italy was already not a very rich country, very developed country compared to others. So in the early 30s, there was a banking crisis in Italy because the major Italian banks, and actually, before I want to get into anything, I want to talk about the Italian banks. So the major Italian banks, I think I have two off the top of my head. One of them, and I'm not going to remember the name, so you're going to have to forgive me. One of them was outright an organ of international finance. It was created by the Germans. All this money, it ultimately comes from the British and the Dutch. The Germans, the Austrians, and the Swiss, they created a bank in Italy and created on the German model. I think this was in the early 1900s, so that was one of the major Italian banks, just a direct tether and proxy for the interests of the global international capitalist class. Another bank was created by these weird Genovese ancient vampire nobles and landowners and merchants and all these creepy weird fucks, these Italian inbred aristocrats, these creepy vampires. So this is the origin of the major Italian banks, fully private banks. They represent the international capitalist class, and they also represented, in a way, I would argue, domestic feudal interests that existed within Italy that were very old, that dated from very back in the day. The weird, they wear those masks like Eyes Wide Shut, and they're molesting children, and this is what they do. So that they were hit with a crisis in the early 30s because these banks had issued a ton of loans, though there's a dual model from the German universal bank model. I'm going to explain it to you, and I want you guys to bear with me here. So what they would do is that in order to acquire the collateral assets with which to expand the issuing of loans, they would actually become shareholders in these various newly propped up and created industrial firms. So these industrial firms and companies would be created that are expected to yield revenues and grow in size. The banks would have a controlling interest through shares directly, but those shares would then be used as collateral in order to lend out more loans. And the companies in question, these banks are like parasites. The companies are servicing interest to them because they're in debt to these companies, and the debt will never be paid off because this is how the companies acquire, in a combination of shares and loans, that they can collateralize and then thereby, expand their loan mongering, usurious bankster interest. So they don't call it usury, they call it interest, but it's the same thing. Majority shares, I would say the original starting capital that made the industries and companies possible in the first place. So the Italian capitalism had a very peculiar peculiar, strange character from the outset. So in the 30s, when we're talking about industries in Italy, when we're talking about the means of production, so to speak, the banks own that shit. We're not talking about like private captains of industry and bold, audacious. These are, all of them were slaves of the banks. Okay? And you need to understand that context to understand the nature of the fascist nationalizations. Wink, wink, and nationalizations. Okay? So there was a banking crisis, and because these companies that a lot of them were originally created through the loans that these banks issued, they were underperforming, just like the rest of the world. So they were not doing well. These industrial firms were being hit with the global crisis that everyone else was, and they were increasingly insolvent. Their liabilities, the bank's liabilities with respect to them, was endangering the banking system within Italy, was endangering the big banks and the banksters, and thereby, endangering their fucking foreign vampire paymasters or whatever, right? The international financial networks of capitalism. So these banks that have assets, they have shares, and they have loans. They're bad loans. This is a typical crisis of capitalism. It happens all the time. It happened in 2008. They have these shit bad loans. They need to fucking get rid of them because they're threatening to destroy the banks. And so the banks, they had these horrible loans, they had these worthless shares, and these outstanding liabilities that were an immense burden on them. Immense burden. So, what did Mussolini, what did Mussolini do and the fascist state do within Italy? Did they suddenly, the corporatist vision of the syndicalism, did they suddenly have a change of heart and decide to now we will tell the capitalists what to do? No, I'm going to tell you the Ponzi scheme that happened in case one of these anime retards try to say that fascist Italy nationalized shit, which they didn't. What happened was one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in the history of Europe, which is saying something, right? This thing called the IRI was this new institution created by the state. And what it did is it relieved the banks of their outstanding liabilities with respect to their loans as well as their shares in these industrial firms. And the IRI took the burden from the banks that the ownership of those things entailed. Now, how did it acquire the loans and how did it acquire the shares? Okay, let me explain this Ponzi scheme to you. How did the IRI acquire the controlling shares in these various bankrupt and insolvent companies to steer them and restructure them and whatever it did? How did they do it? So when they say nationalization, what comes to your head is like Bolshevik style expropriation. They're just going to take it. That's not what they fucking did. So let's just start there. They didn't nationalize it. What they actually did is they issued bonds in order to acquire the loans and the shares from the banks, the controlling shares in the firms. They issued bonds in order to finance it. So they paid for it. That with the nationalization compensated the owners, the banks, okay? But here's the hilarious part. This is the important part. And I want you to, who did they sell these bonds to? These state bonds. Who did they sell the state bonds to pay for it? To the banks. So the banks bought bonds from the state, and the state used what the banks gave them in order to literally relieve the banks of their liabilities and rescue them. So it was like it was like worse than an Obama bank bailout. What happened is the public sector assumed the liabilities. The capitalists fucked up, so the public sector not only had to pay for it, but in paying for it, had to indebt itself to these private banks. So the state became indebted through the issuing of bonds to the banks, and the entire purpose of this switcheroo, the state was going to use public finances to make these firms solvent again, to restructure them, to fix them, and instead of the banks getting serviced interest from these shitty, unreliable firms and companies, they had a more secure collateral and effectively a controlling interest in the state. The state was a more secure asset to own. Basically, the banks would own the state itself instead of the fucking companies. And you own the companies, how reliable are they in terms of servicing the debt? Well, clearly they weren't. But if the state takes over, quote unquote, and then services you that same fucking interest on on the debt, but just in a new form, in the form of bonds, it's more reliable. You're using the power of politics and the power of the state to pay debt and pay interest to the bankers. And that is the essence of what fascism is. Fascism is basically when, instead of the market and the private sector, the banksters acquire their usurious interest-mongering debts using the batons of the state. The state takes a big stick and it beats the shit out of the debtors, in this case, the Italian public, in order to pay the creditors. Usually in a normal capitalist economy, this has to happen in a purely economic way. But because of a crisis in capitalism, the banksters will weaponize the state and use public resources and assets in order to pay themselves, in order to exact their pound of flesh, proverbially, and so to speak. So this is actually what happened in Italy. The private sector took over the state effectively, fully and completely. The firms in question that the IRI took over were never independent to begin with. They were controlled and owned and created in the first place by the banks, but they became a financial liability because they were underperforming. And so that we're talking about a banking crisis. We're talking about these banks. Not only they're no longer able to be paid anymore, the foundations upon which they rest are being shaken. So what Mussolini and the fascist state actually did was they rescued the banks. So anytime somebody says the IRI nationalized the Italian economy, just tell the truth. What the fascists did was rescue the banks by making the public assume their liabilities, which is exactly what happened. At no point was the economy expropriated. At no point did the state actually fucking own anything. Everything they owned was financed from bonds that were issued on credit from the banks themselves. If the state owned it, the state wouldn't be in debt to the banks, but they were. This like weird, by the way, creditor-debtor syzygy, it's like it was a prototype of the American super-imperialist system described by Hudson. But you see this in Italy, absolutely. Because here the state, the IRI, is both a creditor by assuming the bank's liabilities, but also a debtor. Because in order to finance the acquisition of these shares in these firms and the acquisition of the bank's debts, it had to sell bonds. And the bonds are themselves servicing interest or servicing payments. It's funny when they say, oh, the fascists were fighting the capitalists. The entire state was made a prostitute of the capitalist class. The public continued servicing the bankster vampires in a new form, assuming all the liabilities and the burdens. But where were the benefits? Well, there weren't any benefits. And although the scheme was a failure, it couldn't work. So the balance sheet is not going to square when you think about it just in these terms. Okay, the state is going to issue bonds. What is going to guarantee the reliability of these state-issued bonds? What's going to securitize the IRI in the Italian state? Because everything is going to shit and, well, it's war. Let's go invade Ethiopia. Let's go conquer and attack other Croatia and the Balkan countries, whatever. Steal their resources and steal their land, and that way we can make the balance sheet even. We can somehow ensure that the whole thing doesn't spiral into an infinite void and vortex of insurmountable debt, and we just take resource. I mean, by the way, does that sound familiar? This is what the USA is basically de facto doing right now. Actually, not even de facto, de jure about to do right now with Venezuela. So they socialized the losses. That's what happened in fascist Italy. They socialized the losses. The state did not nationalize anything in the sense of expropriation. They didn't just take it over and say, this is ours now. They paid for it using loans, bonds, given to them by private banks. They paid for it. Not only did they recompense the banks, they did it on interest. Yeah, the Italian military-industrial complex was also controlled by the banking cartels as well. So there was no state-owned enterprise in Italy. Nothing was nationalized. So let's compare that to China. How did China acquire? It's like so stupid I have to say this. Let's compare the IRI to Chinese institutions, the People's Bank, People's National Bank, the various state-owned enterprises, the various assets. How did the CPC acquire the various means of production that it does own within China? Well, They originally had them in the first place because under the Mao era, it was owned as such. It was a traditional Soviet-style socialist economy. So the CPC in the state already was the controlling interest. There was no mediation by any banks. They built it in the first place, and they did not build it on credit. They didn't take out loans from banks in order to do so. They did so through sheer willpower, through the Mao era mass mobilizations. Now, admittedly, in the first 5-year plan of the People's Republic of China, China was taking on immense debts from the Soviet Union. And the Great Leap Forward and the rest happened because China didn't want to be indebted to the Soviet Union anymore. So it had to just build everything up from scratch using sheer willpower. So the way the fascists like to posture, oh, we're just gonna do it with the pure will, the way they posture and this facade they put up, well, the Chinese actually did use sheer willpower to build up their economy. And that's why China has state ownership to this day. They didn't have to borrow from banks and recompense capitalists no, they just fucking did it. Italy, you don't even have to look at the industrialists and the capitalists, because those are not the people at the highest point of the pecking order. It's the bankers, okay? The bankers in Italy were in command and control of the whole thing. The whole history of Italy, the whole history of Germany, it's all about finding roundabout ways to service interest on debt. Germany was the same thing. And you know what's funny about Italy? Even post 1935, with the sanctions by the League of Nations that was imposed on Italy, at no point did Italy legally declare the obligations that it owed Britain for World War I null and void. It never did so. The outstanding payments the private banks of Italy owed to the foreign banks, they may have been disrupted by war, but they were never legally nullified. They were still on paper and legally, and the fascist government could have nullified them and canceled the debts, and they didn't, because there was an expectation that if the fascist powers won the war, that the international capitalists, the financial capitalists, would be recompensed and would be, continuing to extract and suck the blood of the resources and capital and wealth of Italy and of the world, of Ethiopia by proxy in the world. These cartels, as Rev is saying, this is another example of the Ponzi scheme of Italian fascism. Private companies and banks would threaten to go on strike. They would overcharge on their shitty equipment, their war equipment, and if the government didn't pay the prices that they wanted, they would threaten to go on strike. So this was the fucking circus of fascist Italy, where literal capitalists, just like in Ayn Rand's book Atlas Shrugged, they would literally threaten to go on strike. Has that ever happened in China? I think that guy Jack Ma, he said one thing semi-critical about China's government one time. Nobody ever heard of him again. But in Italy, where supposedly it's the same thing as China, or China's a fascist country apparently, in Italy, the so powerful and emboldened were the private parasite class that they would threaten to go on strike if the state didn't pay for their ridiculously overmarked shitty assets. So when people say China is just like fascist Italy because the IRI Italy, the state owned, they're taking excerpts from these retarded books where they're like, that one excerpt where effectively Italy had the second largest state owned assets in the world next to the Soviet Union. They take that and read it, and there's all these assumptions that come with that they just really based Mussolini just took it from the capital. No, he paid for it on credit to private banks who themselves wanted to get rid of it because it was a liability that was threatening to destroy them. The state didn't actually own it. How can the state own it if they were indebted, first of all, to these banks? When they say, they controlled it. Controlled it for what purpose? To restructure them and make them solvent so that they could be given back to the banks. That's another thing. This wasn't even considered a permanent solution. The idea was that the state was going to take these liabilities, take on the burden, fix the mess the capitalists made in the first place, and give it back once they did that. This is the reality instead of the fake false history that they're trying to feed you. The IRI was not an organ for genuine nationalization. Genuine nationalization means I'm taking this factory. This factory is mine. I own it, and that's it. That's not what the IRI did. The IRI paid for shares that control it, sometimes controlling shares, sure, that banks owned in some firms, that these shares were liabilities, by the way, and took the liabilities, the debts as well, and paid for them not only using public coffers and public treasuries, but by issuing bonds to the very same banks. And you want to know the worst part? This is the fascist playbook. You want to know how else the state paid for this? Or I should say the public paid for it? How did the public pay for this? This burden that the state took on behalf of the banks. How did the public pay for it? Well, in what literally is one for one the same thing as austerity that we see today, like in Javier Milei's, Argentina and elsewhere, the Italian fascist state privatized a bunch of previously publicly owned assets to pay for this shit. Literally, privatizations happened on a monumental scale in both Italy and Germany under Hitler for this exact reason. Who actually owned the shares in the first place in the IRI? Were they just faceless public servants and bureaucrats? No, they were literally the former capitalist industrialists and landowners themselves, the agricultural landowners. So there you go. That was not nationalization. That was not the state is taking over. No, it didn't take over. It became a de jure, literal tool, direct weapon of the capitalist class to accomplish what it could not through the market. It became the prostitute. They go, well, China also has billionaires in China. Hey, let's look at the balance sheet. All this shit was created by the CPC. All of it. The whole economy was created by the communist state. And to whatever extent there was a private sector in China that was created first by the state. Second, people were beneficiaries of a regime-led system. In fascist Italy, you had a pre-existing capitalist class that made the state its bitch. So the order is completely reversed. In China, the CPC and the state owns, controls, and beats the shit out of the capitalists. Or let's call them the entrepreneurs, to be politically correct. But in Italy, the opposite was true. The capitalists and the aristocrats, they all banded together and made the state their prostitute, their bitch. And they raped the Italian public wholesale, looting public treasuries, indebting the Italian people unfairly and unduly, and privatizing public goods in order to pay for it. So it was a big Ponzi scheme. And by the way, doesn't this make sense? I mean, even from what you know of the aesthetics of Italian fascism, just judging off of that, you really think the state just came in and took over? No, they didn't. It was a big... Mussolini was putting on a big show. Doesn't it make sense it was a Ponzi scheme the whole time? Because by the way, it was. It was just a big Ponzi scheme. What, you think they wiped the debts and just said, whoa, we're never gonna pay? That's what Lenin did. See, the difference between communism and fascism isn't that like fascists were more realistic and like, oh no, we don't want to do these utopian experiments. It has nothing to do with social engineering or social experimentation. The difference between communism and fascism is that the communists straight up say, hey, bankers, fuck you, we're literally just not going to pay you any debt, we're wiping it out, we're taking over, like, fuck you, like, literally, go kill yourself. And then the fascist way is like, we have to, of course fascists are more realistic. They're not breaking with international finance. They're not canceling the debt. No, we believe in the sacred institution of private property. When fascists say that, you think they're talking about some Joe Schmo, like small farmer who's defending his ranch with his dogs? They're talking about private property. They're talking about assets and debts owned by banks. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about outstanding debts that have to be serviced through interest. Usury. When they use the term usury, remember this in history. Whenever you read them talking about usury, they're talking about competitive market petty usurers who undercut the big dog, interest-bearing, loan-mongering big bankers, often felt cheated and cheapened by these lower-rate, usurious, like maybe Shlomo Sheckelstein in history. In history, I'm just going to tell you the truth. In European history, Shlomo Sheckelstein would sometimes sit on the corner, and he would give these very, like, cheap, trashy loans, interest-bearing loans, right? And they were competitive, but it was just like small fry shit. And it would disrupt sometimes, and it would fuck up the bigger fish, and what they call usury. The biggest usurers of Europe were Goyim institutions. The Goyim were the most elite ruling class. These are the true usurers. The difference between usury and interest is that usury oftentimes has more competitive rates than interest. But it's the same fucking thing. If you read the Bible, it's the same thing. But, and I have to tell you the truth, the church changed the name from usury to interest. interest. Interest was more reputable, it was more official, but it was the same fucking thing. Maybe there was a Jew on the corner who would offer a more competitive, sleazy rate, and it was less institutionalized. See, the Jews of Europe that were giving out these interest-bearing loans, they were small fry. Look at the Crusades, look at the Knights Templar, look at all these different orders that were created, the Knights of Malta. These are the big dogs with what they call the institution of usury. The Medicis, the Genovese, who were at the Battle of Constantinople. Why? To defend Christendom. Deus Vult. Why do you think the Crusades happened? Deus Vult, because the Muslims had nothing to do with it. Actually, they had nothing to do with it. They didn't care about Muslims. But Muslims are just some desert people in Arabia. They were targeting the other churches so they could have this monopoly or the enslavement of the entire world through usury. And Michael Hudson, I think his book, I don't know if it came out yet, he's writing a book about it on the Crusades and the whole purpose of the Crusades. All the things the right wing glorifies. So fascism, the Crusades, and Deus Vult and all this nonsense. It's all a bunch of Ponzi schemes. There's two wings of politics. The left wing, the revolutionary wing, and then literally, I'm not kidding, the Ponzi scheme wing. Think about this. Trump is a Ponzi scheme. They unironically like Trump. They liked him, I should say. Unironically. He was a big Ponzi scheme. Fascism is a Ponzi scheme. The Crusades was a Ponzi scheme. World War I was a Ponzi scheme. And let me tell you right now, what's one of the biggest Ponzi schemes that I just exposed the right wing that they're a bunch of Ponzi scheme peddling and duped suckers. The crypto shit. At the end of every, people are just trying to make money. That's it. They're a bunch of scammers. Ponzi scheme. I mean, God in heaven forgive us for being such suckers. The ACP, we're the only ones that are not in it for money. We're not scamming anyone with this Ponzi scheme, with a Hustlers University, with shit coins or nothing. We're actually the genuine entrepreneurs. Let's build manufacturing. Let's build industry. We're just broke. We can't do it yet. By the way, that's going to change. But we're the only ones that are not scammers. Every other political faction are scammers. Moneyed elites. I mean, look, you know how stupid we are? Fascism was a Ponzi scheme. Never forget it. It was a big Ponzi scheme. And then they try to say the same about communists, but you look at the bank account of Lenin and there was literally zero. What was Stalin's wealth? Stalin had one pipe and like one outfit. Nothing. They try to claim that Castro had trillions or something, and it was a lie. They try to claim that Hugo Chavez and Maduro, they try to say Xi Jinping. They're liars. They're liars. Communists are not motivated by money. I see this meme too much where they go, the Italian fascists actually took it to the capitalists. They were the prostitutes of the capitalists. The IRI took it. You got that from Keith Woods, who took it out of his ass. I think, did they all get this from Keith Woods, this lie? Is that where it originates? The IRI was a Ponzi scheme to indebt the public sector to the banks. It had nothing was nationalized. Nothing was nationalized. Nationalization means you own it. The state never owned it. Well, they controlled it. Okay. To do what? They controlled it, and since they managed it, to fix it up and clean it up for the banksters. That's all they fought, and they made the public pay for it. I saw a tweet with 500 likes repeating this lie, that the IRI nationalized things in the Italian guy. No, it fucking didn't. The IRI didn't fucking nationalize anything. Nationalization means you take it. Nationalize equals take. You take it, and it's yours. Can't belong to you if you're taking it on credit from private banks. At no point did fascist Italy become autarkic. You guys need to make a meme mocking the fascists who say that the IRI, say this was Obamanomics. This was nothing. Say, put Obama's face. Put Obama's face and say, this is the true fascism, bailing out the banks. I wanted you guys to understand and combat and counteract this argument whenever you hear it, because it's a disgusting lie that I keep seeing. But the fascists nationalize. They didn't nationalize a fucking thing. These people don't even read the book and nationalize nothing. So I saw a meme get 2,000 likes where they were like responding to a leftist. They were like, the fascists are the ones that fought the capitalists. Some bullshit like that. Why is it so hard to be normal? It's like, you know that meme where they're driving and there's like a retarded screaming autistic child? Why can't you just be normal? Why do you have to flirt with the phalange and all this? You realize, do you think the Spanish Republicans were like transgender weirdos or some shit? They were honest, good communists. Just fucking be normal. Why do you have to flirt with these stupid like banker, gimp, slave, like child raping death squads? Why do you have to sympathize with these weird like satanic freakazoid? Why can't you just be fucking normal? Oh, we have to be the phalange. Oh, we have to be this. We have to, oh, the black shirts. Why is that appealing to you? Because you think communists are Care Bears? Is that what you think? You think communism is like Weenie Hut Juniors and fascism is where the cool people are? Because you've got it dead fucking wrong, buddy. Okay, being a gimp, deranged gimp going around killing, and there's nothing cool about that. All right, the communists were just honest, good people. I mean, what can you say? And they were warriors and they were tough. You know, isn't that sad? It's like stolen valor from the Italian partisans. The Italian partisans, I mean, they were running through grenades and they were some tough motherfuckers. The partisans were sons of the soil over the hills and the mountains, and they were some tough people. They were true red-blooded warriors. And then people with the black shirts, were what? Do I have to say it? They were doing the Pride Parade on Rome, and then they did what? They were gimp slaves of the banksters. They would go and massacre workers and go to the countryside and massacre, beat, and rape farmers and shit. There's nothing tough about that. So why should we hear this? Why do I have to keep hearing these people that are so confused? They want to sympathize with the historical fascists because they don't know the real history of the communists. They think communism is Weenie Hut Juniors because, and you know, who is to blame? It's, well, a combination. The Trotskyites who fled the Soviet Union that came to the US that completely poisoned the well. And then, of course, the CIA completely discrediting, blackening, and twisting the good name of the left wing and of the Marxists and of the communists. They totally fucking twisted it. And by the way, all the bad things you hear about the Republicans in Spain, it came from the anarchists. Two things. The anarchists were literally adjacent, sociologically and ideologically, to the phalangists, to the fascists. The only reason the anarchists were feuding with, it was like interfactional, interfascist infighting. Same demographics, same background, same origins, same history. It was like a split, the syndicalist in the syndicalist movement. So anarchists were always within proximity to the fascists. In Spain, there was some, just like how sometimes in when communists are fighting rightists, you'll get some Trotskyite on the side of the rightists. This was the same thing in the case of the anarchists who were on the side of the Republic. At every turn, the anarchists were undermining the Republican government. They weren't following orders. They were engaging in treason, you could say. The alignment was very limited in practice. And then at the tail's end, when it became decisive, when Stalinists were on the cusp of taking over the Republican government, the anarchists and the Trotskyites and the liberals all colluded to open the gates for Franco. So the real element within the Republican movement, the Stalinists, were snaked by the liberals, the anarchists, and the Trotskyites. And these people were never ever calling for the extremism and the wild, insane, the thing about shooting nuns, or this was some fascioid mental rot the anarchists shared with the phalangists. And it had nothing to do with the Stalinists in the Republican movement, or the genuine, real Republicans in Spain had nothing to do with that. Nothing. So if you sympathize with the counter-revolution in Spain because you hear about atrocities committed by Republicans, understand these were atrocities committed by the anarchists, the same people that betrayed the Republic later on. And by the way, the atrocities were overwhelmingly committed by the monarchists anyway, but I digress. But you know, sometimes, guys, I look into these people that sympathize with historical fascism, and you'd think that, oh, you know, you just misguided, and then you look into them and their psychology, and then like these people are in like dog raping discords and monkey torture. I'm making that up, but it's like there's just some very dark, weird people with very dark psychologies and personalities. These are not people looking for good. It's like, no, we could show you the good path. No, these people, they're not looking for anything good. They have very, very sick, morbid mental illnesses that make them attracted to depravity. Again, they are attracted to depravity. These people are attracted to depravity, absolutely. These are the people that are ripping their body parts off, and they're eating them, and they're gore fetishists, and they're just a lot of horrible things. So I'm telling you the true history. I'm giving you real history right now. You know, I'm not giving you the fake stuff. I'm not giving you nonsense. I'm giving you true history.